Hey everyone, welcome back to these lectures on Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism. And this is the 9th talk, and so it is public. And of course, if you want to have access to the full series, if you're interested in all the other talks, then half of these are for subscribers and patrons only. So find the link for the Patreon in the description below. Now, moving forward, we finally come to almost in a way the card, right? The most important card, at least for this podcast. For those who have ever asked the question, where does the name Hermitix come from? It's from this card. Now, unfortunately, with Meditations on the Tarot, with the author, maybe Valentin Tomberg, very likely Valentin Tomberg, he's dealing with the Marseille tarot deck, which unfortunately lists this card not as IX in Roman numerals, as in 1 before 10, but actually lists this as V4549. Now, with the one of the more common other tarot decks, it is Hermit and then IX, and I basically put those together, and it's Hermitix, and that's where the name comes from. So before we, now you know that little digression, we can jump in with the Hermit or La Hermite. And basically that's where the name comes from, and now we can jump in with this card. Once again, the author begins from both the Hermetic current and the Gospels, beginning with this quotation from the Cosmu. Isis, give heed, my son Horus, for you shall hear the secret doctrine, of which our forefather Camphis was the first teacher. It so befell that Hermes had this teaching from Camphis, the eldest of all our race. I heard it from Hermes, the writer of the records, when he initiated me in the rite of black perfection. Then into for Trismegistus, who, I do not know how, has completed the discovery of virtually the entire truth, has often described the power and the majesty of the word, has illustrated by the foregoing quotation where he, Hermes, proclaims the existence of an ineffable and holy word. His pronunciation is beyond the power of man. That's Lactantius Divinae Institutionis. And finally from the Gospels, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Matthew 7:14. The author begins immediately with the Hermit, and he's extremely pleased to arrive at the Hermit. It's a card that he's excited and almost welcomed by arriving at. He describes him as a venerable and mysterious figure, and he immediately begins with his description, which is one of the more minimal and simple of the cards. He is a solitary man dressed in a red robe under a blue mantle, holding in his right hand the lantern, which is red and yellow, and he's leaning on a staff. So there's 3 elements there that we need to focus on in a sense, but they don't play as big a role in a very grand symbolic sense as one might first think. But we have the mantle, the lantern, and the staff. And for the author, it was the Hermit. It was this card as this wise old archetypal figure who was the most intimate and cherished master of the dreams of this author's youth. And the author states that really he is the master of all the dreams of all youth in every country. The Hermit is someone as a figure, and I use this word archetypal figure, who is enamored by the call to seek the narrow gate and the hard way to the divine. The author asks us to think of a country, a time, a place where the youth hasn't been haunted by this figure of the Hermit, the figure of the wise and good father, the archetypal spiritual father. The Hermit is someone who's clearly passed through this narrow gate, which Matthew is referring to in the Gospels. He walks the hard way, he walks the path, whatever name one wants to give it. He is, almost the ultimate seeker. Ultimately, he's someone you can trust, someone who you could love, you could venerate in love without limit, without idolization. He's someone you can trust because he's taken that path, and it's clear he has. The Hermit is someone you would go on a journey to meet. And the author goes on to expand that every country has its equivalent of a hermit with gurus, literal hermits, desert fathers, spiritual fathers, saints, Socrates and Plato were this equivalent for the pagan youth of Athens, etc. And Eliphas Levi is brought in here with a quotation, and he says, "He is the initiate who possesses the lamp of Trismegistus, the mantle of Apollonius, and the staff of the patriarchs." The hermit, however, will always really be the solitary man with the lamp, the mantle, and the staff he possesses. Okay, so the lamp is the gift of letting light shine in the darkness. He's someone who has gone on the path, he's taken the walk, he's sought out, and he's bringing back a light into the darkness via his wisdom. He has the ability also of separating himself in that solitary nature once again from biases, from collective moods, from the desires of race, nation, class, and family. To listen to him is to understand not a bias, but the hierarchical harmony of the cosmos, of the spheres. And this is represented by his mantle. But at the same time, and this is one of the very key important things of the hermit, is he is extremely realistic. Not only does he stand in the domain of reality very firmly, but he doesn't even do it on 2 feet. He does it with 3. That is to say, he advances having already touched the ground via immediate experience with his staff. So when you look at the card once again, you'll notice his staff is firmly on the floor before him. He's 3-pronged, firmly on the ground. We often say get 2 feet on the ground. The hermit is so realistic that he has 3 feet on the ground. It harks back to that quote I adore by Alfred Orage, where he says the last degree of esoteric teaching is plain common sense. And really this is what it's about. Have head in the clouds, sure, but you need your feet on the ground first. You need to have that understanding of reality. And so, as such, with these 3 things, he creates light, he creates silence, and he creates certainty. This is his and the triple concordance into relation to that which is clear, right? That which is in harmony with the totality of revealed truth. Right? The hermit not only represents the wise man, who is the reflection of the Father in heaven, the above, the below, but he's also representative of medicine in concordance with the lamp, the mantle, and the staff, being a 3-fold synthesis. It's sort of a medically fanatic philosophy with regards to some form of synthetic healing. And this is quite a strange thing to think about at this juncture, but as we go through, we will begin to understand. But the main bulk of this card, because the hermit as a figure is extremely clear to understand. I think in a Jungian sense, he's so deep-rooted as an archetypal figure that we understand this idea of the wise old man. And so there's this very short thing at the start by the author on the idea and the character and the figure. And then he goes into the bulk of this card, which is to do with 3 antinomies. Okay, and for those who know of Kant, they'll know of antinomies, but it's not as full on. He's talking about an idea of basically two opposing sides to oppositional forces, and the synthesis of these in regard to an antinomy. So these are 1, idealism and realism; 2, realism and nominalism; and 3, faith and empirical science. And between 1 and 2, those 2 forms of realism aren't the same. We'll get to that. But the concordance of this 3rd term throughout this card, once again also in relation to the staff, is collectively accounts these to 9. For those of you that are into your numbers and things like that, you can have fun with that. And this being the 9th card of the tarot. And so we have to go through these antinomies to understand these 3rd terms which arise from these 2 opposing structures. So, firstly, we have this first antinomy, which is idealism and realism. So, here with idealism, we have with idealism of the idealism-realism split, we have with idealism the idea that consciousness is prior to everything. And then with realism, we have the idea that the thing is prior to consciousness. Right. With the realist says that notions, laws, ideas are derived by objects of knowledge, things in the world, and the idealist saying, on the contrary, that notions, laws, and ideas are projected from the subject of knowledge into and onto objects. So knowledge for the realist then is a correspondence between object and intellect, and the idealist is reliant on a theory of coherence in relation to truth. That truth is absent of contradictions in this systematic idealist handling of the ideas. There is an intellectual coherent system formed from the intellect. Truth for realism is the intellect corresponds to the object, and truth for idealism is that truth is that which constitutes a coherent system in the intellect, right? It avoids contradictions within the system that's being developed from the consciousness, which is before everything. The reflection of the world, then, reflected in the intellect, is the ideal of knowledge for realism, this reflection of the thing, of the object back. And the reflection of the world within postulates and categories, things which form that coherent system of the intellect as a coherent system, is the ideal of knowledge for idealism. Right? Wherein with realism, the world would be bearing the word, and with idealism, the intellect would be bearing the word, capital W, word of God. Okay, so for within realism, the world bears that word within its objects, within that world which comes to us, which we see. And with idealism, the intellect is bearing something, an intellectual thing in relation to a system. The author, of course, begins to ask, well, which one's right? The idol of realism is the thing, entering us into a dualism of darkness and light, the thing and the thought. And with idealism, its ideal or idol is that of the human intellect, which is sitting at the throne of God, right? Entering into a monism. Everything is the intellect. And the author says we should not really prostrate ourselves either before the world, which is realism, or before the intellect, before idealism. That is to say, let's not really put ourselves in either of these camps of idealism or realism. Let's prostrate ourselves in adoration of the common source of both the world and the intellect, which is God. And here he turns to John, who says, true light that enlightens every man coming into the world. And also, all things were made through him, and nothing that was made without him. It's both that's John 1:9 and John 1:3. Therefore the thing, and therefore the world, and its source, and the intellect, and the light of thought, all of these are from the source of God. So what we're talking about in all of these cards for the author is not realistic, nor is it simply idealistic. What is it then? It is for the author logoistic or logosistic, okay, being founded on the logos, of the logos, not founded on the thing, and not founded on human intellect. It's founded on the word of God, which is an objective manifestation, whereby the world of prototype underlying this is the phenomenal world itself, a subjective manifestation. Okay, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness receives it not. John 1:5. There is darkness both in the world and both within consciousness. And that is to say, there are places within the world and also places within intellect where light has simply not yet penetrated. And thus evil, ugliness, and illusion and certainly exist in both the world and in consciousness, negating the idea that this is all realism or idealism. There is a possibility for darkness to be in the world, and there are places where there is darkness in the world. Equally, this same holds true for the intellect. And so between these two positions of the understanding of darkness, you can understand that the source is God, and in relation to all of this, it's the light and the word of God, which is as a source, which is of importance. However, this darkness, which is not penetrated by the word, and not penetrated by light, is not the source of consciousness. It's not the principle of the world. So any correspondence between this darkness and the world and the intellect would not be truth. It would just be a double illusion. Objects are only real in the sense of realism when they are real in the word, and likewise intellectual construction is only true in the sense of idealism when it is also true in relation to the word. This is all to do with revealed truth and revelation. Once again, looking back to that idea of the legitimacy of the revealed truth from above as opposed to that science which is built from below. So the world of our experience is the phenomenal manifestation of both the word from above and the evolutionary world of the serpent below. Equally, the world of our intellect is the experience of the light of the word from above and the ruse of the darkness from the serpent. Both these things are perfectly existing, and they both have relationships with revelation, revealed truth, and light and darkness. That is where the author draws a line with idealism and realism, understanding that it's not either. It's logosistic. The synthesis of these two is to understand that both enact as reality, but once you understand the source, it's from God. Well, then neither can hold their position. Which moves us to the second antinomy, which is realism and nominalism. Now, as I stated, this term realism has nothing in common with the realism I've just spoken about. Okay, realism here signifies objective reality to notions which are now usually designated as abstract, but within medieval philosophy were designated as universals, whereby the thought which denies the reality of universals and only admits to particulars is that of nominalism. So we have this realism now of this second antinomy, which is realism in relation to the idea of universals, and nominalism in relation to the idea that only particulars exist. Okay. So this realism, one second, let me just this realism does differ in the sense of realism as opposed to idealism, in the sense that it is a matter of the objective reality of universals and not to do with the correspondence between the notions of the intellect and the reality of objects. So you could quite easily say, well, when we're thinking about universals, is this in relation to the development of coherent system? And it's not to do with the correspondence between the notions of the intellect and the reality of objects, as with the prior idealism. It's to do with an objective reality of universals. It's really a question of a totally different problem. And realists in this sense, with regard to the problem of the reality of universals, are for the author extreme idealists. In fact, in the fact that their concern is the problem of the priority of the intellect or the object. So, anyway, the medieval doctors saw the problem of universals as at the very center of philosophy, with everything being separated into realists and nominalists, or realism and nominalism. However, a third school arose, according to the author, that of the conceptualists, not playing a role of synthesis, but playing a role of an intermediary. So let's look at this problem. Okay. The essence of the problem is whether, with regard to universals and particulars, the essence of the problem is whether or not something called horseness, as in horses which gallop on the plains, the animal, a horse, something called horseness, to be like a horse, right? Whether or not this thing is anterior to individual horses, or whether it is immanent in the individual horses, or whether lastly it is posterior to the individual horses and only is derived by them by way of abstraction. Okay, so looking at some philosophers who've used this throughout history, the originals, Plato would say that horseness exists as an idea before the horses. There is this idea of horseness, and then they fall into that. Whereas Aristotle would say that horseness only exists in the horses as a principle of their form. However, according to the conceptualists, people such as Immanuel Kant, horseness would be a concept formed by the mind by way of summarizing the common features of all horses and abstracting from them particular characteristics. So, of course, that's the basic overview. You can sort of understand it. You have the universal that already exists, the particular, and then the conceptualists deriving it in a quite not a deconstructionist fashion, but a different fashion. So when this question is really understood in relation to the idea of horseness, it's not exactly passionate. Well, why does that matter? However, when it becomes a question of mankind and the world, then it becomes a problem of creation. This is quite a peculiar thing to think about. All right, it becomes a problem of creation, emphasis on that word creation, which differs from Genesis. Within creation, the idea of the plan of the world is anterior to the act of its realization, whilst in Genesis, or within evolution, there is not an idea or plan, but rather a force immanent in substances and individual beings, which pushes them via trial and error to seek some form of progression. Ultimately, then, when we see this question with respect to humanity, it's one of Adam and creation or evolutionary genesis. It's a big question. Generally, then, there are two rules. There is the realism. The general is anterior to the particular. And there is nominalism. The particular is anterior to the general. So for realism, the general is of higher objective value than the particular. And for nominalism, the particular is more real and of higher objective value than the general. In other words, for realism, humanity is of higher value than the individual. And for nominalism, the individual is of more or higher value than humanity. I'll repeat that because that's the bit where it makes a bit more sense. For realism, humanity as a general category is of higher value than the individual as a particular. And for nominalism, the individual as a particular is of higher value than humanity as a universal. So for realism, there would be no human beings if there were no humanity. And for nominalism, that we would know no humanity if there were not human beings. So, being the author, he says, well, who is right? The author states that realism has as its idol the connectivity, which is anterior to the collectivity, which is anterior to the individual, and the last individual soul, which has a place in this justification of condemning Jesus Christ, right? From John, it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and the whole nation should not perish. This is the idea that the individual in relation to the universal, suddenly the particular doesn't matter. And this same kind of tribunal, this idea of, well, the individual doesn't matter in relation to this greater universal. We saw this during the Inquisitions, in which not so-called noxious individuals were sacrificed for the interests of humanity. You know, the noxious particular is sacrificed for the interest of the universal, or for the church, which is this is ultimately the route as well for the author writing this in the 70s and then published in the 80s in relation to why the extermination of various groups throughout history for the greater happened. And so, however, nominalism is blind to for the author, nominalism is blind to ideas, to truth, to beauty, to goodness, because they don't exist as these objective realities. They are only matters of subjective taste. Therefore, for him, no serious science of philosophy would be able to exist if nominalism was the only intellectual training which was there. Right? So nominalism ultimately would just give rise to a multitude of sects of subjective taste. Everyone would believe and think in their own way, and it would atomize the church into a mass of smaller religions according to personal taste of each individual. Does that remind us of anything which happened in the 16th and 17th century? I think it does. Therefore, we cannot dispense with realism if we value the existence of objective truth. However, we can't do without nominalism, which itself is the vision of the world whereby each individual is unique and irreplaceable. For the author, this means that without nominalism, one wouldn't be able to say during the Lord's Prayer, "Hallowed be thy name," right? Without believing in the uniqueness and holy name and uniqueness of the soul, the individual soul of each living being. So on the one hand, you need realism to have these objective realities of truth, beauty, goodness, but you need nominalism in relation to the importance and higher value of the individual and the particular to be able to have that individual life of the soul and the life of the free will and the personal growth. So what do? So the problem of universals, says the author, the problem of universals was resolved by the fact of the incarnation, where the fundamental universal of the world, the Logos, became Jesus Christ, who is the fundamental particular of the world. Here, the universal of universals, the very principle of intelligibility, the Logos, became the particular of particulars, the very prototype, the personality, Jesus Christ. So the Gospel of John, according to the author, is the principle whereby the principle of universal knowledge with the being of individual love are synthesized from heart to heart. For him, symbolically, water is united with fire. Vilified water, the substance of baptism, and fire are not consumed into the particular, but they enable participation in eternity. Baptism itself is the union of realism and nominalism. The union of the head from above, God, with the heart of the individual in the human being. The Word became flesh. The universal of the Word, of the Logos, becomes the particular. And this brings us, and that's the end of that antinomy, and this brings us to the third antinomy, faith and empirical science. And here the author begins with this one from another quote from the Gospels, from Matthew. Truly I say to you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move hence to yonder place, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. Matthew 10:7-20-21. For the author, the 20th century replies to this idea of this taking of the grain. And it replies with the taking of the grain of hydrogen and reducing mountains to dust. Faith doesn't move mountains in the modern world, but science does. Is this because, the author asks, we don't have a mustard grain of faith? To answer these questions, we have to ask what faith is and what empirical science is. This faith which can move mountains, the author asks, is this identical with the faith belief, which is regarding the certainty of doctrine? Is it identical with the absence of doubt with respect to the authority from above? Is it identical with hope, with optimism as opposed to pessimism? So for the author, he gives the example. He says, well, many insane people display an absence of doubt with regard to their ideas, right? They're completely certain in their ideas, but they're insane. They would, therefore, if their ideas were true, be able to do miracles if faith was nothing other than the intensity of belief and confidence, which insane people have. This is proof itself that faith isn't simply an intensity of belief and confidence and hope alone. Therefore, it's regard a question not only of the intensity regarding a certain certainty, but rather the intensity with regard to a certainty of the truth. So, the faith which can move mountains must be a product of the union of the thinking, feeling, and desiring human being with God, with truth. Such a faith can only be complete if it is a union of man and God. This is why illusion cannot engender faith. So miracles due to faith are really testimonies of the truth. So the faith when nothing is impossible is the state of soul when God works in the soul, when God is also working in the soul. Okay, it's a state of the soul concentrating on the truth of the intensity of the vertical in relation to the certainty of God. It's not a certainty of logic, not a certainty of authority. It is the union of the soul with God. It attained via attention, via effort, via confidence in relation to one's approach to God. We are often told to approach God confidently. So faith is divine breath in the soul, justice, hope is divine light, and love is divine fire in the soul. This leads us to the definition of empirical science, with electricity, magnetism, two examples of forces which have been harnessed by humans within the domain of empirical science and are as such the work of empirical science. We can visit people who are thousands of miles away. We can fly to the top of mountains. We can go on expeditions. We can measure and quantify. This is all the work of empirical science. But what the author asks is, what are the basic principles really that explain all this? Well, the author states that really the first basic principle of empirical science is doubt. I mean, it's doubt and skepticism in the first place that science has even begun to establish its force in the world. To develop its foundations is really from the essence of doubt. It is from the doubting of past traditions that evolution, hormones, vitamins, atoms, and the ideas of the subconscious, just to name a few, have been discovered at all. This doubt sets all of this in motion. But the author asks, can all this really be attributed to doubt alone? Evidently, doubt, of course, is necessary with regard to these findings. However, the author gives the example of Newton, right? So Newton, of course, doubted the traditional theory of gravity, but he also believed in the unity of the world and therefore in the cosmic analogy. This takes us all the way back to the first talk on the idea of analogy. And the author states that doubt set his thought in motion, but faith rendered it fruitful. It was part of a more harmonious whole. For the author, there are four principal dogmas of scientific faith. The unique substance at the basis of phenomena, the human mind being able to reduce this to a unity, evolution, and the collective and organized effort in accordance with the method of doubt and empirical verification, which is continued from century to century and called the scientific method. These four things are the dogmas of scientific faith. The author once again here goes on a digression regarding the Kabbalah, which I have removed this because it's a whole other thing, and it's not what I wanted to focus on in these talks. So, it's of course unsurprising that empirical science becomes aligned for the author with the idea of knowing good and evil, right? Eating of the fruit of the tree, possessing once again the fruit from the tree of knowing good and evil. That importance of knowledge. Of course, this takes us back to the Garden of Eden and what it is to know, to the extent that one is not trying to be alongside God but is actually trying to become God. And this is often what's trying to happen in empirical science. And for the author, this is why it's called the Enlightenment. It is a quest for opening your eyes upon the whole horizontal. It is a subsumption of a false vertical into the horizontal for man to become like a god solely within the horizontal. We go back to that understanding of the idea of the difference between revealed truth from above and artificially created truth from below. And of course, within empirical science, we're merely opening our eyes, in fact, to more facts, and that is to say we are opening our eyes to more of the horizontal. We become sovereigns over the horizontal. All that science can promise us is what is within the horizon of the horizontal. It can promise quantity, but this is at the price of quality. Science reduces quality to quantity, says the author, and this is what it calls knowledge. What then should one do when confronted with this choice between science and religion, or between faith and empirical science? The author asks, is it really necessary to choose? And the point regarding choosing is that within the scientific domain, we need to add the definite vertical aspiration upon this horizontal aspiration of science to be able to make, once again, the sign of the cross, which we spoke about in earlier talks. That is to say, between these two is the complete separation of the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the world, and in synthesizing these, we begin that ascent, that slow ascent that we spoke about before. The author talks about this in relation to the idea of crucifying the serpent, the serpent of the horizontal who promises you the world. That's to say, putting the serpent of the below and of the horizontal onto the cross, whereby the serpent exits solely from the worldly and material and horizontal and begins to mirror the creative word, and the truth of this becomes not solely truth, but it becomes a method, whereby the metamorphosis of scientific faith will be transformed, and transformation of its own dogmas into methodological postulates, which is to say that such things as the will to power of science of the below and of the material world, and the unlimited growth of man's domination within the below, will eventually lose this indifference and will become more and more inclined to the good in relation to the vertical entering into the horizontal. And we can look at this, actually, it's like a macro form of repentance, right? When we look at that word repentance and we take it back to its Greek roots of metanoia, meta in relation to metamorphosis and change, and noia, what we really have is a metamorphosis of being, a metamorphosis of knowledge. And some say, well, it just means change of mind. But no, it's like a huge internal change of mind. And this is what science needs to do. But for that, it needs that relationship with the vertical. So, in this sense, once all this happens, empirical science will cease to be amoral or morally indifferent. It will begin to side with health and construction, with life and well-being. So, I've spoken enough about these ideas of these synthesis and these dualisms of science and faith, etc. Now we move into a section which begins, the author just suddenly does all these things to tie it all together. The gift is called, the section is called The Gift of Black Perfection, or The Gift of Perfect Night, which harks back right to the beginning of this talk, those early quotes. And it takes us back to the idea and the stress that these cards are meditations. They are spiritual exercises, and the Hermit is one of them. And so for this reason, these antinomies are really to be meditated on. These are preceding meditations. Don't aim at solutions, but aim at a form of confidence and courage with regards to one's spiritual endeavors. One arrives at a state of mind in which all that they know and perceive is put into thesis and an antithesis, and it's a raising of light within one's mind when it's often plunged into the darkness of the doubt between these two forces. And so you can see nothing but the light of these two contrary theses, whether it's realism or idealism, etc. There's light there, right? There's some form of knowledge. And the ultimate thing about this exercise is, in relation to these antinomies, is the endeavor to draw light from the darkness. That is to say, well, between these two positions there is a darkness. And you aim yourself at that darkness as a means to draw the light from it, which is not only unknown, but supposedly unknowable, this synthesis. The point of serious antinomy, it signifies two luminous poles of light between which there is only darkness. And it is in this darkness, in this synthesis, which resides the solution to the antinomy. And so one is quite literally creating light from darkness. This is to say that one is stating, let there be light. It is a question of darkness in instances where it is a matter of resolving, of resolution, of finding synthesis. And the author goes on a digression with regard to Hermetic forms of synthesis, also called neutralization or the neutralization of binaries. And so ultimately, all in all, this is a quest to find the third term. Think about the history of trinities and threes. And so now I can sort of begin to bring this card together. Right? The Hermit is the spiritual image of he who follows the methodology of this gift of black perfection. You know, the light from the darkness. The one who is searching for the synthesis in the third term. The one who is searching for true impartiality. Solitude is the method, as we know, for this form of searching. One has to be profoundly alone to be able to face the contraries, binaries, and antinomies which divide and schism the world of truth, both externally and internally. He who seeks synthesis seeks true peace. This is someone who can never take part in opposition. The Hermit then is not someone who takes sides. He is not someone who has any respectful division. He is someone who is necessarily alone. He doesn't embrace human causes. He is noisily opposed to them because he's only loyal to the cause of truth. And this is why he is ultimately condemned to profound solitude. He is both an external hermit and a hermit internally. For he can never be given the joy of plunging himself into some form of collective action or collectivity. He will never be able to say we in the sense of a collective we in a group of people. He is sober. He is alone. The hermit in this regard is a travelling salesman. He makes his way nomadically from opinion to opinion, from belief to belief, from experience to experience, tracing the route so as to know the methodology and way of synthesis and thus peace between all these things. Always being equipped with his mantle, lamp and staff, no one can walk for him, and his work is peace. There is no need, of course, to take pity on the hermit. His joys are intense. His joy is in truth. It is in the happiness of meeting fellow solitary travellers, other hermits who are also on the quest for synthesis, peace, and ultimately truth. He has the joy and the responsibility which takes us all the way back to the Gospels. From Matthew 6:320. Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. His joys are those of profound silence, those of revelation, those of heaven. His solemn presence speaks in the language of eternity. He has nowhere to lay his head, and his thoughts are always of the kingdom to come and the Son of God. The Hermit of the ninth card is a man of heart, a solitary man who is walking. He has found that the heart is a solution, not the heart of motion or the faculty of being passionate. It is the heart of the Christian. It is that of love. The peace that the hermit seeks is itself founded upon the realization of the supremacy of the heart and the human being with regard to the work of salvation, the work of the salvation of the soul, and the restoration of the reign of the heart in relation to Christian love. And that is the Hermit, and that is the ninth card. Once again, thank you all for watching these, and I will say again, if you've enjoyed them, then there is 13 more to go, and a half will be for patrons only, and the links for the Patreon are in the description below. Thanks everyone who already does support me. That patronage also just keeps everything going. This podcast runs solely from donations, so it is much needed. And if you've been listening for a while and thinking about it, it's $5 a month, and you get all this exclusive content, and you get to support the podcast. So thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you.